Hi, and welcome to History 363, Eastern Europe, Life and Death on the Eastern Front. My name is Robert Green. Over the past several weeks, we've been thinking about how the war itself has been remembered in Central and Eastern Europe since 1945, and we've talked about how scholars and historians have waded into very contested waters concerning difficult questions, such as wartime collaboration, the motivation of perpetrators like the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101. And I want to conclude the course in this, our final week, by thinking about the various ways in which the war has been memorialized. And to do so by looking at war memorials and celebrations, particularly in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia from 1945 to the present. Historical memory is an arena of contestation, as we've seen with the Historischer Streit in West Germany, or the more recent debates surrounding the Wehrmacht exhibit in the 1990s, or the debates in Poland today, as we talked about last week, concerning the interaction between Poles and their Jewish neighbors under German occupation. To engage in the public memorialization of an event through the construction of a monument or building a memorial or a museum, whether it be the Holocaust, the Vietnam War, 9/11, etc., to do that is to make a set of choices about how that event will be represented and remembered. It requires setting certain definitional parameters that establish in the very process the meaning of that event. So a monument then makes a didactic statement. It depicts visually, monumentally, what the event means, or will mean, or is supposed to mean in the collective memory and imagination of the society for whom the event is being commemorated. How the event is to be remembered, and what it means for us, or for the viewer, or for the society today. And the point I want to make in my brief comments today is that this process is neither innocuous nor as straightforward as it may seem. At the core of the matter is the key question of who writes the history. Who decides what is the proper way for that history to be remembered? What is included? What message is sent? And just as importantly, what is excluded? What is left out of the official version, of the official commemoration? What meaning will be affixed onto the losses and sufferings or triumphs of the past? And always, what are the present-day stakes for choosing to memorialize the past and remember the past in a certain way and not in another way? Right? There's a set of choices that are involved here in the construction of a monument, creating a visual speaking text that sends a particular message, right, to the society and to the individual who views it. So let's look at some Soviet examples of monumental commemoration of the war as a point of entry into this historical question. And I've mentioned, and our readings have borne this out, I think, the Second World War is perhaps the most important moment in 20th century Russian history, and is remembered to this day, 70 years down the line, as both the most traumatic and the most triumphant event in modern Russian history. As you can see, I think this tableau of Soviet monuments makes that point clear. Each of these three monuments, and I want to talk about each in turn, is a variation on the motif of the sword of victory. Right? The statue on the left comes from a monument erected in the Ural Mountains, right? The natural border between Europe and Asia. As we talked about a few weeks ago, Stalin ordered that thousands of Soviet factories be dismantled, shipped east on trains, unloaded, and rebuilt so that Soviet industry should not fall into the hands of the Nazis. And this effort helped to save the war from a production standpoint. It ensured economically, industrially, a Soviet victory over Hitler. And here is a close-up of this statue on the left from the Urals. As you can see, the statue is positioned over an eternal flame. This is a very commonly encountered sort of motif in monumental Soviet-era representations and remembrances of the war, the idea of the eternal flame, the flame that is not extinguished, just as the memory of those who sacrificed their lives for the cause, similarly, will not be extinguished. So there's a kind of symmetry here between the notion of eternity, represented by the flame, symbolic of popular memory and gratitude. So the statue is positioned over an eternal flame, and it shows the worker presenting this sword, hot from the forge, to the Red Army soldier. Right? The worker presents the soldier with the instrument of war that the soldier and his comrades will use to smite the German foe. And this particular monument was built outside of the city of Magnitogorsk, once the heart of the Soviet steel industry. So here you see the monument in its context with the less than dazzling cityscape of Magnitogorsk behind. So this monument, this particular statue, represents not only the contribution of the soldier on the front lines, but of the workers who, through their labors, armed the Red Army, right? Provided the Red Army with the tools, the weaponry needed to defeat the German foe. And this notion of collaboration, of union between like-minded social groups, in this case workers and soldiers, is again a common motif in Soviet propaganda from the time of the revolution all the way to the very dissolution of the USSR, and I think we see it quite nicely expressed here. The soldier wields the sword, but it is a sword placed into his hands by the workers. This second monument in the middle, maybe a more familiar one to you perhaps, it comes from Stalingrad. We've talked about the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Soviet army suffered more than 1 million casualties, where hundreds of thousands of the city's civilian population, too, were killed, captured, and wounded. And the statue is known as the Mother/Motherland is Calling, Rodina Mat Zavyot. And if you recall, when we talked about visual wartime propaganda a few weeks back, we saw the famous image, I should have included it here, of the woman in red holding the prisyaga, the oath that a Red Army recruit is supposed to swear upon entry into the Red Army, and it says the Mother/Motherland is Calling. So that same title is used here, again, brandishing the sword of victory. She's calling upon her children, the sons of the Soviet Union, the sons of Soviet Russia, to answer her call to defend the motherland. And we've talked about the sort of matriarchal, familial, and nationalist, patriotic dimensions of Soviet wartime propaganda. We see it here. The motherland personified as a mother calling upon her sons to do battle. When this statue was built in 1967 to commemorate the 15th anniversary, I'm sorry, that's not the 15th anniversary, the 1967, the 22nd anniversary of the Soviet victory. My math is a bit off. It was the largest statue in the world, 280 feet from the tip of the sword to the bottom of her feet. The sword alone is more than 100 feet long. And it's a magnificent structure. If you look at it in context, it's truly amazing. Here you see the statue is positioned on a hill, and the Stalingrad War Memorial, of which the statue is the centerpiece, looms over the cityscape of Volgograd, the present-day name for Stalingrad. To reach the statue, you have to climb a path of precisely 200 steps, one step for each day of the Battle of Stalingrad. Here in the lower left, you see a diorama/museum of the Battle of Stalingrad, and if you go in, there's actually a sort of painted kind of 360 mural diorama of the battle. It's quite breathtaking. And here, as is common in many of these World War II battlefield memorials, there's an Orthodox church, of course, a Russian Orthodox church, to sort of make sacred the site and to make sacred the sacrifice of those who gave their lives. And here, a third and final representation of the Sword of Victory. This is a statue on the right, built by the Soviets in Treptower Park, outside of Berlin, in 1949. Of course, in 1949, the Soviets were occupying the eastern part of Germany, what was to become East Germany, part of the Eastern Bloc of communist countries under Soviet influence. And the statue shows a Red Army soldier in the familiar guise of savior, rescuing here a small child who clings gratefully to his neck. The Soviet soldier is shown as both a savior and a victor. And the sword of victory handed to the soldier, wielded by the personification of the motherland, is finally now lowered. It's finally at rest. The swastika here at the bottom has been smashed. The work of the soldier is concluded. The fascist enemy has been defeated. So the swastika is smashed into the ground. When we talked about wartime propaganda a few weeks ago, we considered how it served as a means of mobilizing the populations of the combatant powers for their nation's war effort. We saw this with regard to Nazi Germany, with the inculcation of Nazi ideology into the training and experience of German soldiers. We saw it in the USSR, for example, how the war was presented visually and in poetry and in song as both a struggle for Soviet socialism and a battle for the Russian motherland, combining both these sort of ideological and patriotic nationalistic dimensions. Monuments and memorials generally seek to project a particular uniform message. There can be multiple dimensions, but the message shouldn't be muddled. And if you see here, these are not texts, visual texts, that are hard to discern. In other words, the meaning here is fairly apparent. Right? It's fairly easy to tease out the symbolic significance of what these monuments are supposed to represent, and that's kind of the point. It's intended to be, as we'll see, sort of didactic. They send a message, and taking these three images together, the monuments represent and reflect some of the key themes that figure in Soviet-era representations of the war. Themes of labor, duty, patriotism, sacrifice, heroism, and always the memory of loss. Public memory is never static. It's always in flux. And in the piece I asked you to read this week by Steve Norris, Memory for Sale, we see how the war has been officially commemorated in Russian public culture from 1945 to the present, and how political and social changes in that long period were reflected in the way in which the war was celebrated and the memory of the war remembered. Norris shows also how those changes helped to give shape to the way in which the victory and its meaning were represented and understood in Soviet and now post-Soviet Russian society. The earliest Victory Day celebrations in the USSR focused on Stalin as the architect of the victory over Germany. The very first Victory Day parade in Moscow on Red Square in 1945, Stalin was said to have been incensed that Marshal Georgy Zhukov had upstaged him, that Zhukov, riding on his white horse, had usurped Stalin's own proper role as the victorious conqueror of the Nazi invaders. And this message of Stalin as architect of victory began to recede after Stalin's death in 1953, and particularly by the late 1950s, as a consequence of Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign and the de-emphasis on Stalin's so-called cult of personality. In the 1960s and 70s, under Brezhnev and his successors, the victory parade celebrated the wisdom and leadership of the Communist Party. Stalin himself was sort of taken out of the equation, and the party itself was celebrated. Under the banner of the party, the Communist Party, the Soviet people had marched to victory against the fascist hordes and to defend their Soviet motherland. The message shifted again in the latter half of the 1980s, thanks to the relaxation on cultural and intellectual expression under Mikhail Gorbachev. In that period, the Soviet state and party, in essence, lost their monopoly on defining the meaning of Russia's victory in the war. As Steve Norris writes, as the Soviet Union began to splinter from within, so too did the memory of the war. As the Communist Party lost its monopoly on power, it lost also the monopoly on defining what the war meant, what it was supposed to mean, how it was supposed to be remembered and commemorated. So with the fall of the USSR in 1991 and the end of the Soviet experiment, the meaning of the victory of 1945 and of Russia's loss and sacrifice in the period 1941 to 45, now splintered, was now up for grabs, subject to reconfiguration, even demolition. Consider, for example, the fate of a World War II memorial from the Georgian town of Kutaisi. It was constructed during the Soviet period, back when Georgia was part of the USSR, one of the 15 constituent republics making up the Soviet Union. Georgia, of course, became an independent country after the fall of the USSR in 1991. Relations between Georgia and Russia were strained in the 2000s, and in 2009, the president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, ordered that the monument, known popularly as the Memorial of Fame, be blown up. The official reason given was that the space was needed for a new government building that was going to be built on the site. But the decision was more directly motivated, certainly, by ongoing tensions between Georgia and Russia. Witness, for example, the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, which you may recall. Supporters of the memorial, who wanted it to remain intact, defended it on the grounds of tradition. This is part of who we are. This has been here for decades. And they made an appeal to patriotism as well. The Memorial of Fame commemorates those 300,000 Georgian men and women who had died fighting against the Germans. So to demolish the memorial would be to belittle and denigrate their sacrifice. But the conviction on the part of Saakashvili and the Georgian government was that Soviet-era memorials have no place on independent, autonomous Georgian territory. And so the monument was destroyed. The Russian government condemned the demolition as politically motivated, which it certainly was. Putin described it as a, quote, shameful act of state vandalism, and, quote, yet another attempt on the part of the Georgians to erase the former Soviet people's memory of their common and heroic past. The following year, 2010, Putin announced that the memorial would be rebuilt in Moscow, which it was. In the former Soviet Republic of Estonia, in the Baltic region, the so-called bronze soldier, shown here, stood on Liberators Square in the heart of the Estonian capital of Tallinn. The bronze soldier was built by the Soviets in 1947, and the statue commemorates the Soviet soldiers who liberated Estonia and the Baltic region from Nazi rule. The remains of a dozen or so Soviet soldiers who died in the liberation of Tallinn were interred underneath the monument itself. Since the fall of the USSR and Estonian independence, the monument has become a major political lightning rod. Ethnic Russians make up the largest minority group in Estonia, about 25% or so of the population. They see this monument as a national treasure. They identify with the message of Soviet unity that it represents. They long, many of them, for the days in which Estonia was part of the good old USSR. But ethnic Estonians see this monument very differently, many of them. Many of them see it as a painful anachronism. They see it as a reminder of how their country suffered not only at the hands of the Nazis, yes, but at the hands of their Soviet liberators as well. Recall that Estonia was an independent country up until 1940, and it was annexed by the USSR thanks to the free hand given Stalin by the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. So for ethnic Estonians who are sort of inspired or motivated by feelings of patriotic nationalism, to be reminded of their liberation by the Soviets is in fact to be reminded of how the Soviets came in and took away their freedoms, reduced their independence and autonomy, and reduced them to the status of a republic inside the USSR. In 1995, the independent Estonian government rewrote the inscription on the plaque beside the bronze soldier. The monument had formerly celebrated the Red Army as liberators of Estonia. Now the new inscription simply read, "To the fallen of World War II." No mention of the Red Army as liberator. No mention of the status of Estonia as a victim in need of liberation. In 2005, unknown assailants defaced the monument with red paint. And in 2007, an Estonian nationalist group hung a wreath of barbed wire around the neck of the soldier with a plaque that read, "The murderers of the Estonian people." Later that year, 2007, the new president of Estonia, bowing to pressure from the nationalists, ordered that the memorial be moved to a military cemetery outside the city center, where it stands today. Here you see its present location. The decision to move the statue, the monument, was itself provocative and incendiary. It sparked a full week of mass riots and protests involving individuals and groups in favor of relocation, those opposed to relocation, each fighting the other. Hundreds of people were detained, hundreds more injured. The Estonian police had to come out with tear gas and rubber bullets to put down the demonstrations. And the so-called Bronze Knights, as they were known, in reference to the bronze of the soldiers' monument itself, or the April Unrest, as it was also known, of 2007, proved to be the most disruptive and divisive domestic crisis that Estonia had experienced since independence. And at the very heart of this was a memory 50, 60, 70 years old at that point, but a memory still very much alive. So in Russia, too, and here we see some images, you can find many more of these online, of protesters and demonstrators and camera crews in the streets of Tallinn during the Bronze Nights of April 2007. Unlike Estonia, but in Russia too, the meaning of the war has undergone revision, not outright rejection, as in Tallinn, but a certain revision. Under the Putin regime, Victory Day celebrations in Russia today have come to be both commercialized and commodified. And here you see a familiar scene on Moscow streets every May, selling patriotic, war-related memorabilia on the eve of the Victory Day celebrations. The war has been sacralized. The memory of the war has been made sacred as well. The Russian Orthodox Church has waded in with its official liturgical view on how the war should be understood and memorialized. You get a sense of that from Norris's article as well, how the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church describes the war officially as punishment for our sins, a divine punishment brought upon the Soviet people by God for their godlessness, for their wickedness. And the eventual victory of the Soviets over the Germans is also seen as the functioning of divine providence, the unfolding of God's plan for the Russian people. And as I mentioned, when we saw the battlefield monuments at Stalingrad, here too, and this photograph comes from Victory Park on the western outskirts of Moscow, so too has the memory of the war been made sacred, has been sacralized, right? This is the chapel of the Archangel Michael. And in Orthodox Christian iconography, Michael is shown to be the commander of the heavenly hosts, ready to smite the devil's forces with his drawn sword. Commemorating the festivals for the end of the war, if we compare video footage of Soviet-era festivals with post-Soviet commemorative festivals, we can see how throughout the period 1945 to the present, Russian political elites, be they communist or post-communist, have sought to choreograph those celebrations, to score the politics of memory in a certain key. And after 1991, that key has been one that celebrates the Russianness as opposed to the Sovietness of the 1945 victory. But as our readings this week remind us, the piece by Norris and Elizabeth Wood, historical memory is always in motion, it's always in flux, it's constantly being shaped and recrafted by forces in and within state and society, by what Steve Norris calls memory entrepreneurs. The American journalist Adam Gopnik writes that revolutionary societies make memorials with an ease that liberal ones can only envy. This comes from a recent piece that Adam Gopnik wrote in The New Yorker about the controversies in this country surrounding the 9/11 memorial, the form it was supposed to take, how that day was to be remembered, how the victims were to be remembered, and the result of the input coming in from various sides, survivors, family members of defeated veterans groups, etc., etc. The result, a kind of watered down compromise in Gopnik's estimation, and the 9/11 memorial, something that may end up pleasing no one. So many concessions had to be made to interested parties and interest groups. And that's why he says that revolutionary societies make memorials with an ease that liberal ones can only envy. Because in a one-party revolutionary system, whether it's Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, the ruling elite, the party, has a monopoly on the manufacturing of the message, right? Controlling the means of communication, controlling the dissemination of that message. Whereas in liberal societies, the process of public commemoration itself is always one of contestation. A society that permits a multiplicity of views to be expressed, even a society such as Russia today, where there are real, if not always clear, limits as to which views are acceptable and which are not, nonetheless, a pluralistic society cannot expect a single monolithic narrative to be accepted or embraced by all elements of the population. And the differences of opinion that we see in Russia today, expressed in the Norris and Wood articles, those differences of opinion that we see today concerning how the war ought to be remembered, questions of where does Stalin figure in to the public memory of the war. As the war recedes further into the past, these differences linger, and they reflect larger divisions in society. As 21st century Russia and 21st century Europe continue to confront the enduring legacy of the 20th century and the greatest disaster and catastrophe of the 20th century, the Second World War.